Before we begin, thank you for being here. And if you enjoy deep biblical history, consider subscribing to help support more investigations like this. Today, we explore a topic that has fascinated historians, archaeologists, and theologians for centuries. The tradition claiming that King Solomon received a ring that allowed him to command spiritual beings. It is one of the most unusual accounts tied to any biblical figure, yet it emerges from real texts, real periods, and real historical tensions. When Solomon ascended Israel's throne, the kingdom entered an era of massive project. The construction of the first temple required thousands of workers, foreign artisans, and an unprecedented scale of stone engineering. But ancient narratives, including the Testament of Solomon, a work dated to the early centuries CE, suggest that something unusual happened at the building site. According to the text, the king received reports of workers who claimed a force was weakening them, draining their energy, or tormenting them at night. These accounts mirror the broader ancient Near Eastern belief that spiritual beings could interfere with human labor. Mesopotamian tablets speak of demons disrupting builders. Egyptian texts mention entities that steal the strength of workers. So the notion wasn't foreign to the region. At the height of these disturbances, the tradition says something remarkable occurred. Solomon prayed for aid, and, according to the Testament of Solomon, he received a sign, a ring marked with a seal associated with divine authority. Though scholars debate its literalness, the ring functions in the narrative as a device through which the king could identify, bind, and interrogate hostile spiritual forces. The temple project depended on stability, whether understood symbolically or historically. The story sets the stage for a confrontation between Israel's wisest king and forces described in multiple ancient sources. It is the beginning of a mystery that would define Solomon's later legends and raise questions about the boundary between myth, theology, and history. According to the oldest versions of the tradition, the ring did not appear as a ceremonial object, but as a functional tool. Its design is described differently across manuscripts. Some speak of a simple iron band, others of a gold seal engraved with a symbol resembling the hexagram or pentalpha. Scholars caution that these later artistic details may reflect medieval reinterpretations rather than the original story. What matters across the earliest texts is the function. The ring represented delegated authority, the idea that Solomon, like priests and prophets before him, wielded divine permission to confront destructive powers. In Second Temple Judaism, spiritual entities were often depicted as bound by names, hierarchies, and legal structures. The ring, therefore, acted less like a magical artifact and more like a judicial emblem. The Testament of Solomon presents a dramatic scene. A young boy, a stonecutter, is targeted by an entity at night. It drains his strength, leaving him unable to work by day. Solomon, informed of this, uses the ring to summon the being. The confrontation resembles exorcistic formulas found in Babylonian and Aramaic incantation bowls, in which naming the entity forces it to reveal its nature. The spirit captured by Solomon identifies itself as Ornias, a name with linguistic connections to ancient Greek daimonology. This detail shows the text's cultural blending, Jewish traditions interacting with Hellenistic thought during the centuries after the exile. Once restrained, the being is ordered to assist in the temple's construction. The narrative emphasizes an idea deeply rooted in Israel's worldview. Anything that opposes God's order can be repurposed to serve it. Yet, the story avoids sensationalism. It frames the event as part of a broader theological argument that Solomon's wisdom extended into realms of spiritual governance rarely discussed in mainstream biblical texts. The arrival of the ring marks a turning point. What began as a practical problem on a construction site becomes a window into the complex spiritual landscape of the ancient Near East. And the king, armed with authority, steps into a role that later generations would interpret in ways both literal and symbolic. The confrontation between Solomon and the first captured entity marks one of the most distinctive scenes in ancient Jewish literature. The young builder, exhausted and terrified, stands beside the king as Ornias is forced into view. Most versions of the text portray the spirit not with monstrous exaggeration, but with a restrained, almost clinical tone. A being capable of harming, yet compelled to answer when confronted with higher authority. This stylistic restraint aligns closely with Second Temple demonology, where the emphasis is on hierarchy, not horror. Solomon questions Ornias in a methodical way that resembles courtroom interrogation. The entity is compelled to state its name, its origin, and its mode of attack. This mirrors ancient Near Eastern exorcistic procedures, where naming a spirit was believed to exert control over it. In Akkadian incantation manuscripts, a troubling being is repeatedly pressed with the phrase, "Speak your name, so you may be cast out." The Testament of Solomon's structure follows the same legalistic model. The spirit reveals that its influence thrives at twilight, a detail consistent with widespread ancient beliefs that liminal times of day were moments of vulnerability. The description is not dramatic, but atmospheric. The boy feels his strength fading as the sun descends, echoing Hebrew poetic imagery in which dusk symbolizes danger and uncertainty. After the interrogation, Solomon uses the ring to place Ornias under command. The king then instructs him to retrieve another entity responsible for disturbing the worksite. Here, the narrative shifts significantly. No longer an isolated incident, but the unveiling of a pattern. The disturbance is not the result of a single malicious presence. It is part of a network of forces described in early Jewish demonology, each with its own domain and influence. As Ornias departs to bring back another spirit, the narrative steps into deeper theological territory. Solomon is not portrayed as a sorcerer, but as a ruler who exercises judicial authority over rebellious beings. This distinction is essential. Ancient Jewish writers were careful to separate divinely sanctioned authority from forbidden occult practices. The final moments of this part underscore the gravity of what is emerging. Ornias returns with another entity, bound and resisting, confirming that multiple forces have taken interest in the temple's construction. Solomon realizes this will not be a single encounter, but the beginning of a long, systematic confrontation, one that will reveal the full landscape of spiritual beings operating in the ancient world. When Ornias returned, he was not alone. Bound beside him was another entity whose presence deepened the mystery surrounding the temple's disturbances. The text describes this spirit as more cunning than violent, a being that operated not through direct harm, but through influence and confusion. Solomon's questioning follows the same methodical structure as before, mirroring judicial inquiry rather than mystical ritual. This spirit speaks of a larger collective, 72 beings scattered across the earth, each tied to particular regions, behaviors, and vulnerabilities. The number itself is striking. In ancient Jewish thought, 72 is not random. It appears in multiple contexts. The traditional number of nations listed in Genesis 10, counted differently across traditions. The 72 elders appointed by Moses in later interpretive writings, and the 72-lettered divine name referenced in early mystical texts. The Testament of Solomon taps into this symbolic resonance, presenting a structured spiritual landscape consistent with Second Temple cosmology. The entity explains that each of these 72 spirits operates within defined boundaries, echoing Deuteronomy's idea that nations were assigned to heavenly overseers. While the biblical text uses restrained language, later Jewish interpretation expands on the theme, describing powers that influence human affairs under divine supervision. The Testament positions these spirits as disruptive remnants of that old world order. Solomon's interrogation continues. He demands the spirit list its domain, its weaknesses, and the harm it causes. The replies resemble descriptions found in Babylonian demon catalogs, where each being is associated with specific illnesses, behaviors, or natural forces. The parallels are not accidental. Jewish communities living under Persian and later Hellenistic rule absorbed and reinterpreted surrounding cultural concepts, placing them within their own theological framework. As the Spirit speaks, Solomon begins to understand the scale of what he faces. The disturbances at the temple are not isolated acts of sabotage. They are symptoms of a larger spiritual pattern, one that stretches across geography and history. By binding these beings, the narrative suggests, Solomon is asserting the authority of Israel's God over all competing powers. The king orders the spirit to join Ornias in laboring on the temple site, reinforcing a theme that runs through the text. Hostile forces repurposed to serve divine order. This concept is rooted in ancient Israelite theology, where even chaotic elements of creation ultimately fall under God's sovereignty. The moment closes with an unsettling realization. If two spirits have revealed a structure of 72, then Solomon's task has only begun. The ring is not merely a tool for isolated incidents. It is the key to confronting an entire network of entities whose origins reach deep into the ancient world. As Solomon continued his investigation, the work at the temple began to change. The disturbances that once plagued the workers, sudden exhaustion, misplaced stones, tools vanishing in the night, diminished. But something else emerged, the sheer scale of the labor being accomplished. Ancient sources describe the stones of the first temple as massive ashlar blocks, some weighing dozens of tons. Archaeological studies of similar Iron Age structures show that shaping and positioning such stones required extraordinary effort. The Testament of Solomon interprets this achievement through a theological lens. The invisible beings, once hostile, were conscripted into the construction itself. The text recounts how the spirits under command carved stone, moved foundations, and cleared underground channels. Whether taken literally or understood symbolically, the idea reflects a deeper truth about ancient authorship. Great feats of engineering were often linked to divine or supernatural assistance. In Egypt, colossal monuments were said to be guided by the gods. In Mesopotamia, protective spirits oversaw temple building. The Testament places Israel within this broader ancient mindset, framing Solomon's engineering achievements as evidence of divine sovereignty manifested through spiritual hierarchy. But the narrative is careful not to portray Solomon as a sorcerer commanding dark powers. Instead, he is depicted as acting within legal and theological boundaries. The ring's authority is consistently tied to divine sanction, not personal ambition. This distinction echoes the difference in the Hebrew Bible between prophetic authority, approved, and occult manipulation, condemned. The text leans heavily on that distinction to avoid any suggestion that Solomon relied on forbidden practices. The forced labor of the spirits also carries symbolic meaning. Many ancient Jewish writings interpret the temple as a microcosm of creation, a structured world brought out of chaos. For the Testament's author, the repurposing of rebellious entities into the building process represents a form of cosmic reordering. What was once destructive is now integrated into the service of sacred architecture. Yet, the cooperation of these beings is not depicted as peaceful. The narrative emphasizes resistance, grudging obedience, and constant oversight. Solomon must repeatedly reinforce his authority, reminding them of the seal they cannot disobey. This tension reveals a theological nuance. Order does not erase conflict, it restrains it. As the temple rises, Solomon realizes he is not merely managing a labor force. He is confronting a system of spiritual influence far older than Israel's monarchy. The 72 beings, each bound by name, suggest a world divided into territories and powers. And the more Solomon compels them, the clearer it becomes that this network of entities is preparing to reveal secrets far beyond the initial disturbances on the Temple Mount. As the days passed, the number of captured entities grew. Each one, forced by the authority of the ring, was required to reveal its name, its nature, and its sphere of influence. What emerged from these interrogations was a kind of catalog, not of monsters, but of personalities, functions, and behaviors that mirrored the demonological traditions of the ancient Near East. The descriptions preserved in the Testament of Solomon read almost like entries in a comparative anthropology of spiritual beings. Some spirits claimed dominion over human emotions, others over bodily ailments, others over natural forces such as wind, drought, or fever. Their characteristics reflect patterns also found in Akkadian Ushbetu lists, Aramaic incantation bowls, and Hellenistic writings that categorized unseen forces with meticulous detail. This shows a remarkable intellectual environment in which Jewish scribes engaged with and reshaped the cosmologies of surrounding cultures. Solomon's questioning followed a consistent structure. What do you do? Where do you act? What stops you? Who gave you this domain? Each question reflects a theological assumption shared across Jewish and Mesopotamian thought. Spiritual beings operate within boundaries. They cannot act arbitrarily. Their influence is limited by higher authority, whether divine law, angels, or the heavenly court described in later rabbinic literature. Some entities described appearances that symbolize their functions. A detail scholars interpret not literally, but iconographically. In ancient writing, physical form often represented a role. A being connected to illness might be depicted as thin or distorted. One tied to storms might be described with wings or shifting shapes. These portrayals help modern historians understand how ancient peoples conceptualized invisible forces. Yet, despite the systematic nature of Solomon's catalog, the spirits were not passive informants. Many resisted, some lied, only to be compelled into truth by the ring's authority. Others begged for release, insisting they were only doing what they had been assigned since ancient times. The tension between their resistance and their forced obedience adds a layer of realism to the narrative, portraying them not as caricatures, but as complex figures within a broader cosmic order. It is at this point in the text that a subtle shift occurs. One of the spirits, when pressed, delivers a warning. There will come a day when the ring will no longer protect Solomon. This prophecy, brief yet ominous, disrupts the king's confidence. The story transitions from documentation into foreshadowing, suggesting that Solomon's control over these 72 beings is neither permanent nor absolute. This moment marks the threshold. Everything until now has been an exercise in authority. Everything after will test the consequences of wielding it. The warning unsettled Solomon more than he admitted. Until that moment, every encounter had reinforced the same pattern. The ring commands, the spirits obey. But this prophecy, delivered reluctantly, almost fearfully, introduced a new dimension. It implied that Solomon's authority was conditional, that his control depended on a balance he could not fully perceive. Ancient readers would have recognized the motif immediately. Kings could rise with divine favor, and they could lose it just as swiftly. The spirit who delivered the warning described no grand rebellion, no heavenly decree, no catastrophic punishment. Instead, it spoke of deception, a quiet, calculated maneuver by another entity whose nature differed from the others. In Jewish and Mesopotamian demonology, deceit is often portrayed not as a simple lie, but as a reordering of perception. The threat, then, was not force, but cleverness. A being capable of manipulating understanding could turn the very tool of authority, the ring, into a vulnerability. Solomon questioned the spirit further, but the answers grew vague, fragmented by reluctance. The entity claimed that the power behind the ring could be reversed if placed into the hands of a particular adversary, one who specialized in imitation and inversion. This aligns with a recurring ancient theme. Certain spiritual beings were believed to mimic divine patterns, creating distorted reflections of sacred symbols. The idea that one of them could manipulate the king's seal would have carried theological weight. For the first time, the narrative shifts its portrayal of Solomon. He is still wise, still authoritative, but now aware that his control has limits. The ring, once an emblem of confidence, becomes an object he guards closely. Some scholars interpret this as a literary device, a way to address the biblical tension between Solomon's divinely granted wisdom and his later moral failings. Others see it as an echo of older traditions in which great kings are humbled by the very powers they seek to master. Meanwhile, the temple construction continues. The spirits labor, though uneasily. Their resistance grows subtle, slower work, evasive answers, coordinated attempts to disrupt tasks without directly defying the ring. This subdued defiance mirrors real-world ancient beliefs about bound entities. Obedience was often portrayed as partial, never absolute. Even under divine authority, spiritual forces retained personality and will. Solomon begins to sense that the prophecy is not merely a distant threat. The behavior of the spirits changes as though they anticipate a shift in control. And within the king's own council, tensions rise. Advisors question his reliance on the ring. Priests debate the theological implications. The narrative makes clear that Solomon's authority rests on a precarious foundation, a single object that could be turned against him. The stage is set. The ring still holds, but doubt has taken root. And doubt, in ancient narratives, often opens the door for downfall. The turning point arrives quietly. There is no battle, no dramatic confrontation, only a moment of misplaced trust. According to the oldest versions of the tradition, Solomon encounters a particular spirit whose skill is deception itself. Unlike the others, this entity does not rely on fear or force. It manipulates perception. Ancient cultures often describe such beings as shifters, not in form, but in intention. Their power rooted in imitation, persuasion, and the subtle bending of truth until it becomes unrecognizable. The Testament of Solomon identifies this adversary as a being capable of taking on shapes that appealed to human weakness. The narrative is not concerned with physical transformation, but with psychological influence. The spirit's tactic is simple. It appears to Solomon in a guise that lowers the king's guard. Later, Jewish commentary interprets this as a moment when Solomon's wisdom, though vast, fails to protect him from complacency. Great kings, ancient writers often noted, are brought down not by armies, but by a moment of inattention. The deception centers on one object, the ring. The spirit understands that to overthrow Solomon's authority, it does not need to defeat him. It needs only to separate him from the seal that binds the 72. The text describes how, through flattery and manipulation, the entity convinces Solomon to entrust it with the ring, perhaps under the pretense of honoring divine command. Once in its possession, the inversion occurs instantly. The force that once bound the spirits now empowers the deceiver. With the ring reversed, the hierarchy collapses. The spirits who once labored under Solomon's authority are no longer restrained. Some vanish from the temple site. Others return to the domains they previously ruled. A few even follow the deceiver as though attracted to the sudden shift in power. The text emphasizes that the change is not chaotic, but calculated. The deceiver does not wage war. It simply removes Solomon's leverage. The loss of the ring has political consequences as well. Without the unseen assistance that had accelerated construction, the temple's progress slows. Advisors notice inconsistencies in Solomon's decisions. Some manuscripts suggest that the deceiver impersonated the king for a time, issuing commands that sowed confusion within the royal court. Whether literal or symbolic, the tradition conveys a single message. When divine authority is imitated rather than obeyed, disorder follows. What makes this part of the narrative so compelling is its restraint. There is no supernatural spectacle, no grand rebellion. The fall happens through strategy, not violence. Ancient authors often portrayed deception as the most dangerous weapon in the spiritual world, capable of undermining even the wisest king. Solomon, stripped of the ring, must confront a reality he never expected. The authority he believed unshakable can be taken, not by strength, but by subtlety. Solomon's return to the throne without the ring is portrayed not as a triumph, but as a quiet, sobering recalibration of power. The deceiver eventually loses its advantage. Some traditions say the ring is cast into the sea and recovered by chance. Others that an angel intervenes. But the manner of its return is not the focus. What matters is what has changed. The ring is in Solomon's hand again, yet nothing feels the same. Authority, once exercised effortlessly, now meets resistance at every turn when the spirits reappear. They do not come trembling, they come wary, calculating. Bound by the seal, they obey in form, but their obedience lacks the crisp precision of earlier chapters. They delay tasks, distort instructions, and follow commands in ways that fulfill the letter but subvert the intention. A dynamic well attested in ancient demonological literature. In Mesopotamian texts, bound entities often comply with reluctance, a phrase that captures the uneasy energy now surrounding Solomon's control. The king senses this immediately. The ring still works, but its influence feels diminished, as though a barrier now stands between him and the unseen world. Scholars interpreting the Testament of Solomon often point to this shift as a literary reflection of the biblical narrative in 1 Kings. Solomon's decline begins with small fractures, not catastrophic failures. The loss and recovery of the ring functions as an allegory for the erosion of divine favor, a warning wrapped in lore. The temple construction continues, but the pace slows. The spirits no longer enhance the labor with the same intensity. Some manuscripts describe how Solomon must compel them repeatedly, reinforcing commands they once obeyed instantly. The text paints a picture of authority strained, not broken, but strained power can be more dangerous than absence. It invites miscalculation, pride, and overreach. There is also a political undercurrent. Advisors who once marveled at Solomon's effortless command of spiritual beings now question whether he should rely on them at all. Priests raise concerns about delegating sacred work to forces associated with chaos and disease. These debates reflect real tensions in Second Temple Judaism, where discussions of impurity, order, and spiritual influence often overlapped with political concerns. Meanwhile, Solomon begins to realize that the prophecy delivered earlier was not about losing the ring forever, but about losing the certainty it once offered. The seal had symbolized perfect authority. Now, it symbolizes fragility. The king who once commanded 72 beings must accept that power gained through divine delegation can also wane through divine withdrawal. The atmosphere shifts accordingly. The spirits work, but the air around them feels colder. The temple rises higher, but the sense of partnership between heaven and earth has dimmed. The narrative prepares the audience for the final movement, not a dramatic fall, but a sober recognition that no king, no matter how wise, can hold absolute authority over forces greater than himself. As Solomon's reign neared its end, the presence of the ring became less a symbol of mastery and more a reminder of responsibility. The Testament of Solomon does not glorify the king's power in its final chapters. Instead, it emphasizes his awareness that authority over the unseen world is never absolute. The spirits continue to serve, but their service feels increasingly formal, constrained by obligation, not conviction. Even the king himself senses that the balance sustaining their obedience is delicate. The tradition describes Solomon walking through the nearly completed temple, observing the stonework carved under both human and spiritual labor. He recognizes the achievement, yet also the cost. The catalog of the 72 beings, their names, patterns, and domains stands not only as a record of control, but as evidence of a world filled with forces that cannot be permanently tamed. This awareness echoes the core message of biblical wisdom literature. Power without humility leads to downfall. Near the end of his life, Solomon makes a decisive choice. Some versions of the narrative say he hides the ring deep within the earth, in a location unknown to all but himself. Others claim he entrusts it to a guarded chamber, sealed with inscriptions that only the righteous could interpret. A few later traditions suggest the ring passed into the hands of later kings, rabbis, or even foreign rulers, each reflecting different historical hopes about restoring lost authority. But all versions agree on one point: it disappears. The disappearance is not portrayed as a failure. It is an acknowledgement. Solomon understood that the ring's power and the responsibility that accompanied it could not remain in the world without risking another reversal. By removing it from circulation, he ensured that no ruler after him could misuse it, misunderstand it, or fall into the same complacency that allowed deception to take it. As the temple is consecrated, the narrative frames Solomon not as a master of demons, but as a king who learned the limits of mastery itself. The 72 beings dispersed to their respective domains, bound but restless, contained but never erased. Their presence becomes part of the unseen structure of the world, acknowledged in later Jewish, Christian, and Near Eastern traditions that continued to reflect on spiritual hierarchies. The final tone of the Testament is not triumphant, but reflective. It suggests that wisdom, even divine wisdom, is not a shield against error. It is the capacity to recognize error and correct course before the consequences deepen. Solomon's decision to hide the ring embodies that recognition. The temple stands. The spirits are gone. The seal is silent. And the story closes with a lesson that resonates across centuries. True authority is not the power to command, but the wisdom to relinquish what should not be held forever.